Our second reading this morning is the partner to the first reading that we heard. They seem to be very similar stories that come from different traditions within Israel. They may actually be variants of the same story. It's quite interesting that these stories occur on either side of the birth of Isaac, the child through whom the promise will go. On either side, there's a story of another child and another family, and of God's special concern for them. Around the story of God's promise through Isaac is the story of another promise. In Israel's story is the story of God's love for a different people. Let us listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. The child grew, speaking of Isaac, and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God came to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make of him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Unless you know the story of Genesis pretty well, you likely didn't notice a small problem with our story today. When Hagar sets out with her meager provisions of water and bread, she also carries her child on her shoulder, a child who, by the way, is in his mid to late teens. You hear a lot about helicopter parents these days, but I've never actually seen a mom carrying her teenager on her shoulder. Now, some may be saying, wait a minute, there was nothing in the story about how old the boy was, and you're right. But if you were paying attention to that first story that told of the child's birth and his name, Ishmael, it said that Abraham was 86 years old then. He's 100 when Isaac is born, and children were typically weaned at somewhere around 3. You do the math. Of course, now that I've pointed out this problem, I should also add that the problem is not really one with our story. The problem is with modern people who do not know how to listen to Israel's faith story, to our faith stories. Like some of the other parts of the Old Testament, Genesis is a collection of stories, many of which existed independently before they were woven together. And the editors who do this don't share our fascination with precise history and facts, and so they make no attempt to harmonize our story, which is clearly a story about a very young Ishmael, with another story that would make him much older. Now, these editors are not stupid people. They are the intellectuals of their day. But they are not setting out to write history or to record events. They are perfectly willing to take these stories and honor them as they receive them. Stories that people probably already knew anyway. They wove these different stories together into a larger fabric. A fabric that would help Israel wrestle with what it meant to be God's people, especially in a time when Israel had suffered defeat and exile. And this fabric, this larger story, begins with a call and a promise from God to Abraham. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. God called, Abraham was faithful, and everyone lived happily ever after. Well, not quite. As we will discover in the adventures that soon follow, Abraham and Sarah take a meandering journey towards the promise, a journey filled with questions and doubts and uncertainties. Through these journeys, the stories put together by the editors, Israel explores whether or not God is to be trusted, explores what it means to be faithful, what happens when you're not, even what happens when attempts to be faithful lead to misguided and unhelpful events. And so Abraham starts out and has his adventures. He grows wealthy And he, from time to time, puts God's promise at great risk to save his own skin. And this goes on and on for some time, but there is a critical element missing. Abraham and Sarah have no children, and they're getting up there in years. How are they to be the founders of a great nation with no son, no heir? Now, from time to time, God shows up and tries to reassure Abraham, but the years continue to go on, and the promise does not arrive. Perhaps the promise needs some help. God helps those who help themselves, some people say. And Sarah decides she will help the promise. And Abraham agrees it's a good plan. Sarah has a slave girl named Hagar. And she says to Abraham, see if you can get her pregnant. Now, this may sound a little sketchy to us, but this was perfectly moral and respectable in Abraham's day. Such a child would be a legitimate firstborn of both Abraham and Sarah. And the plan works. There's a son, a firstborn son. They have helped God's promise come to fulfillment. There's now an heir. And everyone lived happily ever after. Well, not quite. Sometime later, God shows up again and starts talking about Sarah getting pregnant and the promise running through that child. Seems God's not all that impressed with Abraham and Sarah's attempts to help the promise along. The promise will not run through Ishmael, but through a second son. Not that Ishmael has done anything to deserve his place, his fate in the story. And sure enough, Sarah has a child, a son she names Isaac. And Sarah starts to see Ishmael as a threat. He is the firstborn, after all. He's the legal heir, and Abraham loves him. Something has to be done. And she insists that Abraham send away Hagar and Ishmael. She will make certain that the promise goes through her son, Isaac. And so Hagar heads out with her son and what little else she can carry. Abraham's role in this is a bit troubling. He has to know they will not survive long in the wilderness on the meager provisions he provides. Is this one of those moments when people do something despicable and blame their religion? God said to do it. And what of God? God is pretty deeply mixed up in this messy story. The storytellers of Israel do not shy away from presenting us with the mystery, the inscrutability of God. The blessing will indeed go through Isaac. The promise will be fulfilled through Isaac. But that does not mean God's grace and love is restricted to the lineage of Isaac, to the people of Israel. Ishmael will have his own promise. Ishmael will have his own blessing and will be the father of a great nation. What an odd story to be part of Israel's family story of their special covenant with God. Why in their family story this account of God's blessing, of God's creating a great people to an outsider, to one that does not belong to their family? These Ishmaelites only show up rarely in the Old Testament. But when they do, they're typically enemies of Israel. And yet God's care and blessing and love is given to them. These others. What a strange story to weave into Israel's story. In our faith stories, our own meandering, zigzag journeys, our sometimes faithful, oftentimes not attempts to go where Jesus calls us. What does it mean for us to trust the promise? Where do our attempts to help the promise along help, and where do they just create new messes for God to deal with? Messes that perhaps we even try to blame on God. And what about when those messes become too much, when they feel overwhelming? What about when we get caught up in the messes that other people make? Israel's storytellers answer such questions. The Bible often answers such questions with the artistry of stories. It's an artistry that we often miss when we think that the Bible and faith are about information and facts, about formulas that we are supposed to follow. Imagine for just a moment that I have gone and visited the Louvre in Paris, and I've viewed the Mona Lisa. And you asked me what I saw. And I told you, it's a very old picture of a woman. That is a perfectly accurate, factual statement. But it says absolutely nothing about the truth or the meaning or the beauty of that painting. Yet that is precisely the way many Christians handle the artistry of the Bible. If we imagine that the Bible is a handy-dandy reference tool, a rule book, an encyclopedia with information about God and faith, a collection of formulas to follow, we will be put off, frustrated, and sometimes terrified by large portions of that Bible. But if we will stop and savor those stories, if we will gaze deeply into the artistry that those stories paint, we may just encounter the living God. A God who is deeply engaged with humanity. A God whose purposes somehow continue to move forward despite how good we humans are at mucking things up. A God whose grace and tender care and love is poured out on us and also extends to those we would dismiss, to those we view as threats, even to those we don't care what happens to them. Oh God, give us eyes to see, ears to hear, hearts to receive you as you reveal yourself to us in sacred story.